still siblings of the soil who are bonded together by this familial relationship and so must love and care for one another. Plato's useful falsehood is meant to unify and harmonize the different parts of society into a coherent whole. Whatever we might think of Plato's advocating for this falsehood, we should be able to recognize that in it, social myths far more familiar to us. From childhood on, we're taught to think of America as the great melting pot or the land of equality and opportunity for all, even though our social reality is arguably at odds with these claims. Most, if not all, societies and cultures cultivate similar myths meant to form and solidify the identity of a people. Such myths have a social utility, and Plato recognizes this, creating one to serve his own imaginary society. Now this puts us in a better position to contrast Trump's lies with the more workaday dissembling on the part of more typical politicians. Though I don't want to come off as endorsing the idea that politicians should lie to their constituents, there are more or less effective ways of doing it. At a functional level, the point of a lie is to deceive, and in order for this deception to work, the lie must be believed. One problem with Trump's lies is that he frequently denies easily verifiable facts or spontaneously makes claims that are easily disproved, which undermines the ability of the lie to accomplish its purpose. Another problem is that the frequency with which Trump tells lies has given him a reputation as a habitual liar, which further degrades their effectiveness because we're wary of those with such reputations. Yet another problem is that Trump is apparently proud of his falsehoods, as is evidenced by his unforced admission of the lie he told the Canadian Prime Minister just last month about a non-existent trade deficit. This last point, combined with the frequency and brazen nature of so many Trump's lies, puts them in an entirely different light. It seems as if many of these lies go beyond the more typical political purpose of gaining electoral advantage through deception. It seems as if the president is happy if such lies just bring him attention. In fact, if we look at the press coverage of Trump's falsehoods, it seems that the more outrageous lies are given more attention. This tracks with Trump's obsession with his ratings. I don't know, does anybody ever remember presidents that ever talked a lot about their ratings? I don't. And this brings us back to the idea that Trump most values the worldly good of reputation. Except reputation and attention aren't exactly the same thing. For Plato, one can have a reputation for something. For example, wisdom, justice, courage, ignorance, cowardice, and so on. Having a reputation in this sense says something about how one's character is viewed by others. It's true that one's reputation might attract the attention of others, but this is not a necessary condition. One can attract attention in a wide variety of superficial ways, all of which have the effect of saying nothing more than, hey, look at me. One only has to think of how young children misbehave in order to get the attention of their elders. If this line of thought has any merit, it should indicate that Trump's more bald-faced lies serve an infantile desire to always be the center of attention, no matter how that attention is gained. Perhaps this attention for attention's sake should not surprise us, given that the president comes from that part of celebrity culture where one is famous merely because one is famous. But I feel fairly certain that Plato would be confused by such a notion and consider it as the palest possible imitation of reputation. All of this would make many of the falsehood Trump tells an expression of his disordered soul, and to this extent, ignoble lies. Despite its own falsity, Plato's noble lie at least has the virtue of attempting to unify and harmonize society. By way of contrast, recall the overwrought mythology that Trump promulgated during his campaign and continues to spread as president, which exploits and exacerbates almost every fear, phobia, and resentment that divides us as Americans. Whether or not the president actually believes in his apocalyptic vision of the country is almost beside the point. If he is cynically propagating it for political gain, then he's the kind of demagogue that Plato warns us about in Book 7 of the Republic. If he truly believes in what he is saying, then his reason has been overwhelmed by his fears. But if he is selling this myth as a form of self-aggrandizement, which I think is the most likely case, then this shows that Trump has no mastery over his desires. Rather, they have complete and utter mastery over him. Think of the times when the president has seemed to be on both sides of an issue. Has his wildly fluctuating desires caused him to mix up his lies? Or, more disturbingly, could it be that in such instances he literally doesn't know his own mind, because his constant desire for attention has never allowed him to develop and take a measured, introspective, rational position on the issue? What all this suggests is that Trump cannot bring harmony to society because from a Platonic point of view, he can barely hold himself together. Now, I want to stress that when I make claims like this, or call the president disordered more generally, I'm not pronouncing him to be suffering from a psychological malady in any clinical sense. The way Plato is using this term, disordered, is in reference to the way he thinks the psyche or soul ought to be ordered, with rationality mastering the desires with the assistance of the pugnacious. Plato's theory of the soul is normative, not descriptive. At the same time, this doesn't mean that Trump isn't suffering from some kind of diagnosable psychological dysfunction. But this is an entirely different question, and in any case, I'm unqualified to make such a determination. What I am doing is using Plato to highlight not a psychological disorder, but rather a flawed character that is due to a failure of self-mastery. This might be illustrated by the typical emotional development of small children. Young children start out as little bundles of desires, and if these desires are not immediately satisfied, they react by throwing a temper tantrum. But over time and in the normal course of development, children eventually learn to master their desires and anger through ego control, or to use Plato's term, reason. Children that grow into adults who never learn this impulse control aren't necessarily mentally ill, but we consider them to be emotionally immature. On Plato's view, their immoderation in emotion and action retards their ability to cultivate the virtues of courage, justice, but above all, wisdom. The characters of such adults, from a Platonic perspective, are irredeemably flawed. This is why my students and I reacted with extreme alarm in November 2016 when the country elected a president with just such a flawed character and who stands in diametrical opposition to everything Plato claims is necessary for sound political leadership. Countless analysts and political commentators have struggled to understand how such a queerly unqualified candidate could have generated 63 million votes and through the quirks of the US electoral system ascend the political heights. What all of these electoral postmortems make clear is that there's no one simple cause. A deeply polarized electorate, widespread dissatisfaction with the political status quo, economic uncertainty, the distortion of social media and propaganda, blunders in Democratic campaign strategy, low voter turnout, lethargic performance of the corporate mainstream media, civic illiteracy, misogyny, racism, arguable electoral interference by the director of the FBI, and the apparent machinations of Russian hackers. All of these conspired to propel a dull, honest, bigoted, sexist, petulant, egoistic, reality TV star into the Oval Office. But none of these factors, even in combination, are sufficient to explain the election to a high office a man of such low character. The late moral philosopher James Rachels once pointed out that Aristotle's definition of a virtue, which Aristotle defines as a trait of character that's manifested in habitual actions, is problematic because the very same definition would hold for a vice. Rachel's attempted to resolve this problem by claiming that virtues are reasons for preferring a person's company, while vices are reasons for avoiding a person. The idea here is that rational people would prefer the company of those who are moderate, just, courageous, and wise to the company of those who are immoderate, unjust, cowardly, and ignorant. To extend Rachel's line of thinking one step further, people with virtues are more likable than those with vices. What then to make of those who still support the president, who in my view clearly embodies a collection of unlikable qualities and vices? In his short but turbulent presidency, Trump has amply demonstrated that in terms of his character, he is precisely the person he campaigned as. That was no persona we saw in the primaries and the general election, but rather the man himself. It's exceedingly hard for me to imagine anyone wanting to spend any amount of time with him. Yet given that most of his supporters routinely dismiss in the president behavior they would never tolerate in Democrats or their friends or even their own children, it's important to ask, why are they continuing to buy what Trump is selling? I suppose there's a multitude of possible answers to this question, but I suspect that Plato would claim that those who continue to support Trump are suffering from the same deficiencies of character that beset the president. In Trump, they see a figure who reflects their own chaotic collective psyche and who gives full voice to their desires, fears, and resentments. They identify with his antagonism towards Mexicans, Muslims, and other immigrants of color, his fulminations against political correctness, his broadsides against a corrupt and out-of-touch political and media elite, and his frightful vision of an America in decline. Yet at the same time, his supporters cannot recognize the fact that their champion can never satisfy the desire to put these things right, given that many of these grievances are based on flawed perceptions of vague and ill-defined menaces, misplaced fears, and fevered fantasies with little or no grounding in social reality. Moreover, these fears and anxieties have blinded them to the fact that Trump himself is incapable of addressing even a more plausible of their grievances because he lacks not only the necessary kind of knowledge, but also the will to do so, and this for the most platonic of reasons. Throughout this paper, I have taken it as a given that the president is to an alarming degree ignorant of affairs of state. But his ignorance runs even deeper than this. He is ignorant of his own ignorance. It's important to remember that for Plato, ignorance is not necessarily a pejorative term. His famous allegory of the cave clearly shows that it is part of the human condition to be born into ignorance, and for this we are not blameworthy. However, what is blameworthy is to remain willfully ignorant, or worse still, to be wholly ignorant of what you don't know. Plato makes this point most clearly in the Apology, where he points out the foibles of thinking one knows what one doesn't know, which gives one a false sense of wisdom. Over 2,000 years later, in the field of psychology, documented Plato's insight with what has come to be called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which has been defined as a cognitive bias wherein people of low ability suffer from illusory superiority, which causes them to assess their cognitive ability as greater than it is. Plato, right? Ironically, this false sense of wisdom makes it very hard for such people to recognize their own ignorance, which in effect makes it impossible for them to learn from others, or in the worst case, from experience itself. What this means in the case of Trump is that he cannot address the concerns of his supporters because he doesn't know how to do so. But more to the point, he doesn't know that he doesn't know. The president's astronomical self-regard keeps him chained in the darkest regions of the cave of ignorance, along with his most fervent supporters. If there's one single relatively kind adjective to describe Trump, it's self-serving. It's the one constant among all of the various journalistic and biographical accounts of the man. Whatever doesn't affect him doesn't exist at all in his mind. This means that empathy is not in his repertoire, which means he will advance the political interests of his supporters only if doing so also benefits him. Yet even as Trump's string of broken campaign promises grows ever longer, he retains the dogged loyalty, not the logged loyalty, of many who voted for him. I think Plato would attribute this loyalty to a tragic failure in character assessment. Because they have failed to put aside their passions and take an accurate, rational measure of the man, so to speak, to get wise to Trump, he has put them at his mercy. It is perhaps for this reason that Plato was so wary